An Agorist Revolution Through Fiction by Wendy McElroy, May 3rd, 2020. Suppose you're writing a science fiction story set in the future. You want one or more model societies to use as background and possibly contrast. One you consider as libertarian. What should it look like? More importantly, that it should not resemble. Libertarian-like societies have been presented by Heinlein, Le Guin, Russell, Kornbluth, Anderson, and others. None were written in light of the recent explosion of libertarian theory. Since 1969, they were the author's idea of a free society independent of the new scholarly literature and movement debates. Samuel Edward Konkin III. Future Societies. Libertarian Alternative. SEK3's birthday was July 8th, just one day after that of the science fiction legend Robert Heinlein. SEK3 habitually threw a Heinlein-Konkin birthday party that was open to fellow libertarians and free fans, a term SEK3 coined to describe libertarian science fiction fans, with free fen being the plural. At about 11 p.m. on the night of every July 7th, SEK3 would hoist his first glass of black beer, which signaled the beginning of festivities. The science fiction novelist J. Neil Schulman commented, "When we were both alive, it was not uncommon for me to put in a phone call to Mr. Heinlein so I could put Sam on the phone with him, and they could wish each other a happy birthday." This is how highly SEK3 viewed not only Heinlein, but science fiction itself. Those who know SEK3 through his writings on anarchy and agorism may be surprised to learn that he considered fiction to be more important than non-fiction as a revolutionary force for change in society. He focused on science fiction and fantasy, and it was a natural choice. The first step in SEK3's path to agorism was Heinlein's novel The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. When the novel was published in a paperback edition, SEK3 read it almost immediately. It is easy to imagine the 21-year-old SEK3 being captivated by the libertarian revolution launched by colonists on the moon against a totalitarian Earth. And then there was the rational anarchist, who intellectually led the revolution. Professor Bernardo de la Paz was based on Robert Lefebvre, who advocated a school of anarchism called autarchism. Lefebvre promoted individualism, nonviolence, moral responsibility, and self-reliance as a lifestyle. When SEK3 discovered the professor was modeled after a real and living person, he went out of his way to meet Lefebvre. SEK3's life was as much about free fandom as much or more than it was about agorism. His fanish passion attracted novelists, playwrights, and screenwriters because of shared interests in SEK3's enthusiasm for their work. People drawn by his love of science fiction often stayed for his take on nonfiction. Schulman wrote of their first meeting in New York City in 1974, "We found out almost immediately that we shared an interest in science fiction, particularly Heinlein, and the works of C.S. Lewis, whose Narnian Chronicles I'd read as a child. Sam was only the second other person in my life I'd met who had read Heinlein, and the first other person I'd met who'd read Lewis. It was Sam who told me that Lewis had written more than the Narnian children's books, introduced me to Lewis's nonfiction and adult fiction, and took me to my first meetings of the C.S. Lewis Society of New York, which we attended together regularly. Much of Lewis's nonfiction is called Christian apologetics, that is, the defense of Christianity against objections. Schulman came to believe in God. SEK3 attended the meetings despite his atheism because he found the ideas in discussion to be stimulating, and, then, were the wonderful Narnian fantasies. It is rare for a libertarian to be as well read in fiction as in non-fiction, let alone to tout fiction as the more revolutionary form of expression. Indeed, most libertarians would dismiss this possibility. Within so-called respectable circles, especially within academia and institutes, fiction authors receive little more than a passing nod or, if they're popular among students, they may be included in seminars to which they are not invited unless they are politically correct. It is rare for such authors to be invited as speakers, even to libertarian conferences as speakers. Perhaps they are viewed as less intellectual or important than voices from academia. Perhaps institutes fear alienating donors by appearing superficial or not serious about ideas. Years ago, a conference organizer told me she was determined to reach the mainstream by sponsoring writing seminars. Who, she inquired, could do a good presentation on science fiction? I rattled off a list of several authors, all of whom were successful working writers and eloquent people. No, she shook her head. Who can do a presentation? In the end, she invited a philosophy professor who taught a class on modes of being in science fiction. The movement's dismissal of its own fiction and fiction writers is baffling when you consider how many libertarians became politically aware through the novels of Ayn Rand. If the title of Jerome Tucci's pioneering book, It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand, has any accuracy, then science fiction should receive automatic respect. Rand's first book, Anthem, is a dystopian novella set in an unspecified future which chronicles the protagonist's discovery of individualism. Many other libertarians entered the movement through the science fiction of Heinlein, Robert Anton Wilson, L. Neil Smith, James Hogan, David Brin, Werner Vinge, and Schulman. These writers are among the best propagators of ideas in our culture. Although they are sometimes lauded by the wider public, they are largely without honor in their own land. It has not always been this way. Literature played a prominent role in Benjamin Tucker's 19th century individualist anarchist periodical Liberty, for example, even though its clear emphasis was on political issues. Tucker risked imprisonment by publishing and selling an edition of Walt Whitman's book of poetry, Leaves of Grass, which was deemed obscene by the post office, and he was as keenly aware of the novels and poetry from abroad as he was of revolutionary political tracts. His fascination with cosmopolitan literature led him to publish The Transatlantic, a bi-weekly literary magazine. The many fiction works translated by Tucker or his associates include Claude Tillier's My Uncle Benjamin, Émile Zola's Money and Modern Marriage, Octave Mirabeau's A Chambermaid's Diary, Felix Piat's The Rag Picker of Paris, and Sophie Kropotkin's The Wife of Number 4237. These and other works of literature were standard offerings in the Liberty Bookstore. In short, the freedom movement was once vibrant with fiction that it valued as highly as non-fiction. SEK3 was something of a throwback to the 19th century attitude toward fiction, except he elevated fiction to a higher status than non-fiction. The 20th century anarchist Murray Rothbard knew this well and seemed to view it as an eccentricity on SEK3's part, that is, until the two men had a serious falling out. Then Rothbard attacked SEK3 at a point that Rothbard believed showed SEK3's libertarian weakness: science fiction. In the essay History of the Libertarian Movement, in which SEK3 referred to himself in the third person, he explained, relationships between MNR and SEK3 were maximally strained during 1977 when Rothbard joined the Coctopus and moved to San Francisco. Rothbard was described as the Darth Vader of the movement. Star Wars had just been released. Rothbard lashed back with his attack on the space cadets of science fiction-oriented libertarians, and was attacked himself within the Libertarian Party by space cadets, who labeled his faction grub eaters. Note: Rothbard also used the term space cadets simply to describe unrealistically utopian people, such as futurists. SEK3's commitment to free fandom rode a rail that paralleled his advocacy of anarchism and agorism. The two are natural partners. In an essay called A Political History of Science Fiction, Eric S. Raymond argued this point. Quote, science fiction, as a literature, embraces the possibility of radical transformations of the human condition brought about through knowledge. Its stories take place within a knowable universe, one in which scientific inquiry is both the precondition and the principal instrument of creating new futures. The essay correctly calls John Wood Campbell and Robert Heinlein the editor and author who invented modern science fiction. It states, a political aura went through the hard science fiction style, one exemplified by Campbell and right-hand man Robert Heinlein. That tradition was one of ornery and insistent individualism. veneration of the competent man, an instinctive distrust of coercive social engineering, and a rock-ribbed empiricism that valued knowing how things work and treated all political ideologizing with suspicion. SEK3 would have agreed with every word, as his content of reading material after The Moon is a Harsh Mistress can attest. As a student at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where SEK3 pursued a degree in chemistry, his roommate Tony Warnock introduced him to the works of Rand, Rothbard, Lefevre, and other notable libertarian theorists such as Ludwig von Mises. In 1971, he moved to New York City to pursue a PhD in theoretical chemistry at New York University. He lost interest in the degree but became more deeply involved in science fiction and libertarian theory. Acting on his ever-energetic drive to influence and organize, he became a prominent member of the NYU Science Fiction Society, founding the Associated Amateur Press Association, NYU. Fancyclopedia 3 explains APA NYU's origin. Quote, in the winter of 1973 to 74, SEK3 paid a visit to Southern California, attended an LASFS, Los Angeles Science Fiction Society meeting, and participated in an APAL collation. Returning to New York City, he started APA NYU. Earlier in SEK3's NY stay, he had started publishing his fanzine, New Libertarian Notes, NLN, 1971 to 1975, and Clear Ether, CE. A mixture of political and fanish material, NLN appeared in 1971. The first issues included reviews of Heinlein and Poul Anderson, a rare Heinlein interview conducted by Schulman, as well as the beginning of SEK3's own Ron Gold trilogy in finished form. It consists of Agent for Anarchy, Statesman, and Dragonsbane. Of the trilogy, SEK3 wrote in his booklet, The Last Whole Introduction to Agorism, quote, Agent of Anarchy, the first Ron Gold story, preceded Agorism, but the sequels, The Statesman and Dragonsbane, were progressively more influenced by it, and the background history was not set until the third. All were published in New Libertarian Notes and its successor New Libertarian Weekly. CE has been described as SEK3's all-purposes personal zine that was not available by subscription, only in APAs, with Volume 1 being published in APA NYU. Arguably, it was his main artistic outlet. In the pages of CE, SEK3 explained that the personal zine derived its title from the Lensman series. One of his associated publications, And on Green, was the Lensman's way of saying, on target. Then came the move to Long Beach. SEK3 and three companions who traveled with him formed the core of an agorist community called Anarcho Village. They also plunged into the local science fiction fantasy scene. In fact, the four anarchists plunged into it even before they arrived. Their beat-up car, dubbed the Terror Toyota, took 3 weeks to drive across country because of science fiction side jaunts. SEK3 recalled, we stopped in Louisville, Kentucky for the first RiverCon and visited the best-known libertarian science fiction fan back then, Richard E. Geis, in Portland, Oregon. Their first destination, however, was libertarian. They slept on the door of Dana Rohrabacher, who was probably the best-known libertarian activist back then. SEK3 was an inveterate SF-con goer who was well known within fandom for his fanzines and intellectual room parties. SEK3 usually brought his own party with him as well, in the form of friends and fellow writers. Schulman remembered, Sam took me to my first science fiction convention, 1971's Lunacon in New York City, to my first World Science Fiction Convention TorCon in Toronto, Ontario in 1973, and to my first meeting of the Los Angeles Science Fiction Fantasy Society, LASFS. We joined the just-formed Southern California C.S. Lewis Society together in 1975, and Sam and I each served on its governing council for a number of terms. SEK3's first SF-Con appears to have been in 1969. He wrote, arriving at St. Louis Labor Day 1969, your author was as interested in the St. Louis World Science Fiction Convention as much as the National YAF Convention, to which he was a delegate. Again, science fiction and politics ran on parallel rails. Woody Bernardi of the Vegas Science Fiction Association and a friend of SEK3 stated in memoriam, Sam went on to attend cons across the country, and even made it to a world con or two in Europe. Sam also pubbed his Fanish daily free fanzine, designed to compete with the official daily organ of the given con. Sam pubbed daily free fanzine each day of each con he attended since its inception at the El Paso WesterCon. F3 offers a different time frame for our free fanzine's inception, a libertarian SFAPA. It was, quote, founded by SEK3 in 1975 at the NASFI, Los Angeles. Anders Monson corroborates the WesterCon origins, however. I remember putting out the first issues of the Daily Free Fanzine at the El Paso WesterCon in 1996 with Sam. It is likely F3 is confusing Free Fanzine with one of SEK3's other publications. But F3 gives a fair appraisal of SEK3's involvement in Free Fanzine. Quote, he was a regular contributor, but never was its overall editor. F3 quotes SEK3, quote, by the way, I've avoided OE-ship not only to get out of the work, but also because I'm strongly identified with a purist strain of radical libertarianism which is anathema to many more conservative ones who might otherwise wish to participate. The entry remarked, there was a tradition of collating Free Fanzine on almost every con Konkin and his anarcho-friends attended. When he was not attending cons or collating periodicals, SEK3 created organizations that furthered free fandom. One was the Karl Hess Club, which was a seamless blend of science fiction and politics. The club was established on April 30th, 1994 by SEK3. J. Kent Hastings, Brad Lineweaver, and Mike Everling as a monthly gathering for dinner and a speech, which met in Murray Calendars at Marina del Rey. The topics addressed were far broader than free fandom, but it was a prominent theme and constant presence. The Hollywood Investigator reported on one meeting, Libertarian screenwriters discuss sci-fi, Election 2000, and 9/11. The notable science fiction and fantasy authors in attendance included J. Neil Schulman, scripter for The New Twilight Zone, Profile in Silver, and author of The Frame of the Century, suggesting O.J.'s innocence. Brad Lineweaver, Sliders, the classic episodes Moon of Ice. Victor Coman, The Jehovah Contract, under option to Hollywood. John DeChancy, Other States of Being, Witchblade, Talons. Anarchist playwright Ben Pleasance, and Thomas M. Sipos, Vampire Nation. The proceeding provides only a glimpse into SEK3's commitment to free fandom as a tool of revolution, as powerful as scholarship or traditional activism. Indeed, SEK3 believed it was more powerful. A full account requires a book-length treatment. Every treatment, however, without mention of SEK3's most important periodical, New Libertarian Weekly, which evolved into New Libertarian. Again, science fiction melded with agorism. 101 issues of NLW appeared, 187 of NL. The most important issue for this article, however, is the last one of NL, 187. Coman, who established Co-Pubco Publishing Division of the Triplanetary Corporation to preserve and spread SEK3's work, described the final issue. This is the big one. New Libertarian's last and greatest all-science fiction issue with stories by L. Neil Smith and Oyvind Mir, a review of Destination Moon by Brad Lineweaver, tributes to Robert A. Heinlein and the Prometheus Meltdown by Robert Anton Wilson, Robert Shea, Victor Coman, and Brad Lineweaver, with L. Neil Smith and J. Neil Schulman. Also, a previously unpublished letter from Robert Heinlein himself on Why I'm Not Bob. These original issues are from a very small number that escaped the Great Storage Locker default, in which dozens of cases of New Libertarian magazines, constituting over 50% of the extant copies, were either auctioned off or dumped by a storage locker facility, losing them to posterity. As usual, the cover was striking, a space opera-style graphic of Heinlein holding a blaster, with planets suspended in the black sky behind him. From 1974 to his death in 2004, SEK3 supported himself as a pre- and post-production specialist for periodicals and books. His talents grew from typesetting and layout to book design and graphic art, although it is not clear the NL-187's cover is SEK3's work. Whether it is his handiwork, this and other covers have an eye-grabbing quality. SEK3's editing or publishing career did not end with 187, but it is the high point. Output of his own material thereafter was sporadic. It is appropriate that the high point concludes a theme running through his life, from the conversion experience of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, to the annual Heinlein-Konkin birthday, to the final issue of NL in which his mentor is honored. The running theme in SEK3's life was Heinlein. Note: an essential aspect of SEK3's impact on libertarian fiction was his personal influence on many writers that equaled the influence of Heinlein on him. This is unaddressed here because another article, Anarcho Village, Ground Zero of Agorism, deals with this facet of SEK3's personality. Scroll to near the end. Current libertarianism woefully misinterprets how ideas propagate through society and politically inspire people. Fiction can reach the heart and the imagination in a way that non-fiction rarely does. People embrace causes with their hearts and souls as often or more often than with their rational faculties. SEK3 realized this. He did not agree with all of Ursula K. Le Guin's positions, even though he respected and defended her in print against all political critics, but he fully shared her view of revolution. Quote, "You cannot buy the revolution. You cannot make the revolution," she wrote in The Dispossessed. "You can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere." For SEK3, the spirit of revolution within him was science fiction and fantasy. End article.